Hi everybody, welcome to the Scottish Summit 2020 video deck. I'm Sharon Sumner. It's really great to be here with you. I hope you had a fantastic time at the Scottish Summit itself, and if you couldn't make it, well then I hope this accompanies the series really well. So let's talk about student forms with Powerapps and Flow. First of all, who am I? So I'm based in Cambridge in England in the UK, and here's just a few ways that you can get in touch with me. So I run the Cambridge Powerapps and Flow, although now Power Platform user group, where we have a really great bunch of people that get together on a regular basis and talk about all things Powerapps and Power Automate. So let's talk to you today about some of the stuff that I've been doing with my team with those technologies. So today we're going to have a look at a Freshers app that we created, a Student Forms app, and a Room Browser app. Now these were all developed by my team when working with a university local to us. So the university was looking for one of their colleges to have these apps developed that would make life easier for new students, student life during the time they were at the college, and just generally making a cost saving and a value add to the business side of running a college for the administrative staff that are there. So without further ado, let's jump straight into the Fresher app. So for those of you that didn't go to university like me, a fresher is somebody that's joining the university for the first time. So our audience for this app is new students and really the administration team. Our goal is to make administration as seamless as possible and for the new students to not have a long and complicated process to register for university. So the challenge is the sheer amount of information that we need to record and the timeliness of that information, and obviously making it easy to use. So just having a look at the problem statement there, then we have 250 plus. Now this is quite a small college that has 250-ish students coming in each year, so it's quite a nice one to work the app on in the first case. You would want to scale this out, and there are some considerations for that for a larger university. So all of these students arrive on the same day, and that's really a problem, is getting everybody to the same place at the same time. So we wanted to have a little bit about information about travel news and traffic, and we wanted to be able to give all the information and gather all the information from those students to make day one viable. And it amazed me when looking at this, the amount of data that has to be gathered. And let's not even go into GDPR concerns with this data. So all the stuff that the university needs to know before you even start, like what your final A-level results were, which doctor you're registering with locally, are you staying with a college or have you got other accommodation? Are you coming to the welcome dinner? Have you already got a gown? And that you're actually even turning up. And it's a really big stack of information that the university needs to gather. So how are we going to go about this? Well, we decided the solution lie in Powerapps and Sharepoint Online for this particular one. So Sharepoint Online is our secure data source for the collection of the data, and we would link that out to Power BI and other add-ons. But Powerapps was going to be the front end for the university students to see. Now, there's some issues coming up, and those of you that have built Powerapps for multiple users probably know what that is, but let's push on and we'll come across them as they happen. So the Freshers app, the Casper 365 branding is my guys, so don't worry about that. So the Fresher app needs to gather the details, but we're not using it to gather the student name and surname and the college and the course. What we're doing here is we're just the first time into the app only. We are just making sure that we've got the correct person coming into the app. So as I said, some issues, one of the prerequisites for this app to work is that the students need to be in your Active Directory as a university or college. So this particular app requires us to just make sure that the email and password that we've sent out to you, and that would have been via an email address, is correct, and that you've managed to log in and you can confirm for us who you are. This also allows us to get slight things right that we might not have done, like the spelling of a complex surname. So this is a one-time screen that comes up. We then go into the main app to allow freshers to have a little bit of a news feed, and you can see down the bottom here we've got alerts, and then we can jump into the forms themselves. So the alerts is really just for, have we got building work going on, have we got traffic problems, and a lot of that is about getting people to site day one, as I talked about earlier. So the registration forms themselves. Now, these were an interesting project to do because this is a gathering exercise. So we don't need the usual screens where we want the user to edit the data once it's been added in. And as you can see here, the way that we've done that is that each of these forms that we need them to fill in, matriculation, by the way, is just that welcome dinner. It's a university word. So each of these forms that we want them to complete, it's a one-time completion. Now, we're relying on users to get the data right the first time simply because of the volume of data. So we don't need that ability to edit records. Once we've completed the form to the satisfaction of the form validation, we're getting a tick in that screen. And that's deliberately designed to make this a one-time gathering exercise. The most complex thing about this app, as you can see, it's a relatively out-of-the-box app, is this gathering of multiple A-level results. And the way that we did that, as you can see here, is that we collected the exam result in a multiple format list and then had that slider. That was quite a quick run through there, but hopefully you saw that. So that once the slider goes across to say, yes, I've added all of my A-level results, then when you come back to this main screen, it's a check and we're ready to move on to the next form. So we're effectively just doing that single gather point, but where there are multiple lines, we needed to use a slider to say, yes, I'm done, just in case they needed to go off and find additional information or an exact title of a particular course element, etc. So there's a little bit of flexibility in there. So for every one of my apps or everything that I try to demonstrate, I try and put something in that's interesting or new or innovative. But this one really doesn't have very much in there. The one thing that we did do was that we put, and I just wanted to raise this because, and I'm pretty sure everybody does this these days, but it's just a little hint and tip for you, is to put in there a little splash timer. Now, the purpose of the splash timer is to give the on-app load functionality the time and the ability to do what it needs to do. So what we've done is we've basically put a little timer on the page so that the splash screen comes up the first time they go in, and then it's just working out who you are, getting a collection of your data together to make the app run smoothly. Now, for us, we do this with most of our apps just to make sure that from a UX point of view, the user isn't frustrated with the fact that the app appears to have loaded, but there's nothing in the list data, or it hasn't quite got context right yet. So this is just a technique that we use that I thought I'd throw in here just as a quick win for you guys. So the dependencies, as I mentioned, is that the user must be in Active Directory. Now, normally I get a lot of questions about this at the end, and as you can't ask me questions on this recording, please feel free to send them to me, because that is an issue, having to bring everybody into Active Directory before they're effectively a user on site. And that whole process of loading hundreds of people into your Active Directory prior to them starting. And obviously there's multiple ways that you can do this. They can be guest users, etc. But then we have to work out the rules for them being able to have that app delegated to them. So ideally they are Active Directory users with the proper academic license already assigned so that they've got that ability to use Powerapps. So the Sharepoint data in this particular app is held in a single site collection that's only available to the admin staff for that GDPR governance. Now, obviously, if you wanted the students would be able to get to that Sharepoint data if they knew the address. It is obscured. So security by obscurity in this particular app. And again, that's because it is particularly time bound, and it is one of those things that we need to have available for a very short period of time. And again, we may look at an annual clear down or some way of moving that data out each year. Now, what we have done, we've run this successfully for a university for year one, is that we have actually done a clear down using Power Automate to move everything out to a secondary list, and then be able to use that list as reference for the other applications. So the benefits of this kind of an app, like I say, it's relatively simple development once you've got past those dependencies, is that we've effectively got a time saving for administrators here. So they previously had a pack of information going out to the freshers that they had to fill in and get back. Now for 250 freshers with 7 forms, they would maybe send back 2 and then send back another one. So somebody somewhere has got a stack on their desk of every single student and which piece of paper paper has come back. So that's not only filing every time, but it is an absolute administrative nightmare for all of that paper, and things get lost and deadlines don't get met. And normally here we would have a Q&A. So let me think what the most common question I get asked is at this point. And it is usually how much time was saved. And I think if you think about a university life from a business perspective, so how the back end is run, what they tend to do is during the fresher period, they will get in external staff. So whether that is temps, or they will increase the hours of temporary staff that work in the university for a period of time. So you can look at saving all of that administrative cost of taking on people who effectively sort through paper. It's not a job people enjoy doing. So the speed at which we can get the freshers onboarding, it's a better experience for them. They haven't got lots of forms to fill in. And the speed with which we can easily see which data is completed for each student in the back end administratively massively cuts down on the amount of effort needed and the amount of staff needed during that fresher period. The second thing I want to talk to you about is about the student forms themselves. Now, this is the big one. This is the big project, okay? So that was the starter. This is the main course. So who are we looking at for student forms? Now, these are the forms that are used during your life at university. So this is current students that are already in the university, so they've potentially been through a freshers process. The same administration teams that we had before, but now we have a slightly different audience in the mix, in that we have department heads, faculty, and anybody on campus that needs to interact with the students in some manner via these forms. So the challenges then are going to be, so with our particular university, we have a challenge around external user approvals. So our university has one tenancy, and the college, there are 30 of them for this particular university. Each college tends to have its own tenancy. So effectively, the department heads and faculty end up being university-based tenant users rather than college-based users, so they're effectively external users, and I'm going to cover that off in this section. Also, the security of that student data, big concern, and we wanted to look at fund allocation, which kind of sits outside of the forms themselves, so we need to do something with the data once we've got it back. So what was the problem statement? So we had 27 paper-based forms in the college that we looked at replacing. So that in itself is quite a challenge. There's quite a number of forms to try and put in a single app. Anybody that's built an app will tell you it starts getting clunky and slow the more you get the app to do. So we needed a strategy around that particular problem. We need to ensure that data privacy, and we need to provide the tools to allocate the funding. So again, I don't know how much you know about universities, but they have maybe 30 or 40 funds, philanthropic funds, that will donate to a university or a college to be able to allow students to buy books, etc., using that fund money. And it's important to allocate correctly the money to the right fund. If that fund is just for science students of a particular part of their course or a particular subject, then that fund needs allocating to those particular students, as well as the allocation process needs to make sure that we don't effectively over allocate those funds and spend money we haven't got, or refund money we haven't got. And we also needed this external approvers piece addressing. So the numbers got a little bit bigger. So we now have 420 undergraduates, 330 graduates, and 50 fellows and 130 staff. So the 130 staff are on the college's tenancy. The 50 fellows are going to be on the other tenancy. And the graduates and the undergraduates are probably on both. So there's some complexity. And the problems that these users are having are the fact that the problem with all paper-based forms everywhere, that forms get lost, that it's a slow process, you've got to walk it around the building. So general, and data security, obviously, general problems that you get with a paper-based process. Again, the requirements are about confidentiality, auditability, general requirement. So how do we track things back through the process, and that student data. So making sure that we are connected to the right data in the right place. We've also got administrators wanting to make changes to data once it's been submitted. We've got the fund allocation complexity and this external approvers approach. So here are the 27 forms. 27 forms, not 27 dresses. Kind of a weird one. As you can see, I've had to use a really tiny font, so hopefully you can read that. This is just to show you the volume of the things that people need while they're at university. So we've got a departing college form, we've got a gown application form, we've got a bursary application form, and of course anything that's requiring, for example, a hardship request is very personal and confidential to that particular student. We've got transcript requests, we've got change of accommodation requests, we've got change of course requests, travel expenses, all kinds of things that were identified as things that needed to be automated within the university. Now, the way that we went around this was to decide, firstly, we need a data source. Now, we decided SharePoint Online. Now, I can understand why you would immediately think CDS for this one, because of the role-based authentication and the way that you could secure that data. But one thing to consider is that we're working with a university here and we're working with a great deal of students. So anything that we put in place needs to be really light on the licensing side of things. So we went with SharePoint Online, and I'll show you the method that we use to secure that data. And obviously we're going to want Power BI to do the reporting, nice and easy from SharePoint Online. Powerapps to be able to give access to the app, not the data, with the students. That was our big call there, and to be used on the mobile devices. Well, there's a nice twist coming to that one. And Microsoft Flow, as it was called then, must update my slides, Power Automate, to build flows to make those complex approvals happen. And complex is the word. Some of the complexity in those approvals is ridiculous. We have something along the lines of 14 different stages of approval, because that's the way the colleges and universities, it's quite an old-fashioned setup that they have, and it goes through many, many lines of authority before some things can be approved. So this is what we had set up and how we designed a solution to get around security constraints, external user constraints, etc. So let me talk you through this. So if we look on the left, we have the, I wonder if I can get my mouse working on this one. Okay. So we have the finance forms and the change forms. So what we did is we split the 27 forms down into two types. So you're either asking for money or you're asking to change something. And that's really what we identified from the BA around those 27 forms. So these are available within a PowerApp, and that really allowed us to take it into either two apps or a nice navigation structure around both types of app. And that allowed us to also break down the processes for approval, because generally a change form or a finance form will take a very similar path. So the student has access to the PowerApp. So each request goes into a request list, which then has a flow. Now, what that flow will do during the app processing is it will look up the student. Now, the ability to go and fetch that student data has actually moved since we first started the project, and that's because of a licensing constraint. But largely, what we do with the data is the app itself will unload, work out who you are, whether you're a graduate, undergraduate, and who some of the key roles are that are needed within those forms. It does that by going and looking up the data using an API that we developed. So we were fortunate in that the Casper 365 brand is an Office 365 platform. It lives on top of Office 365 to do automation, etc. And so we already had some tooling there to allow us to develop custom connectors and custom code for an API that we could then later leverage, which again I'll show you as I come on to it. So what we did here is we wrote this API that sits between the actual student data on this side. So we have the university has a student database which is available to us in a bunch of tables and views. So this is SQL data that is then coming across with a refresh script through the API to a SharePoint list. Now, to get through security, that API is the only one that can request this data, and it is the only one that's got access to this SharePoint list. So this is completely locked down data, and only the API can get into what we call the student vault. So what that does is the flow will call the Casper API, and the Casper 365 will then do the querying for us, okay? And then obviously down here we have approval flows and we have approvers that are contributing to those flows, all back to that request list. This is what the actual app ended up looking like, and this is version 1. So we have, like I say, finance requests and change requests, and then we added event booking as well, and the ability to go and see your own. So the app itself is not rocket science, and that's really what I'm showing you, is that even though you use the out-of-the-box apps or nothing particularly walk-away complex, there are bigger things afoot here. So it's not just about knocking up an app, surely it can do everything. There are some bigger architectural considerations to make with this data. So we just used a little bit of the colouring from the university just to get that working. So some of the stuff that we had some issues with were the approval processes, as I mentioned previously. So because we have externals wanting to make an approval, and this has changed since we first did this, but I want to show you this because it's important to see the things that people have gone through, because that's how we learn, really. So what we have here is we have a financial transaction that goes through what looks like a standard approval process. And as you can see there, we've got my finances. So the user is able to cancel the request, but they're not able to edit it once it's gone live, once it's gone through. And this approval email that we've made look just like the Microsoft Flow approval email. And in fact, we started using the Microsoft Flow email. So normally you would go to approvals, there it would sit, and you would have this ability to use your email to be able to complete using the kind of lazy approvals mentality. So we thought we were going to use that, but then came the roadblock. So what actually happened was that you were given this URL. Hopefully you can see this clearly. So what we have here is the URL that's provisioned is the tenant, and then it's actually built to say manage environments, the tenant GUID, approvals and received. So you would think that when you go to this URL with this tenant GUID, that it would take you to the correct tenancy and the correct approvals. What it actually did was it redirected you and replaced with your default tenancy. So all this did, because you were logged in as you, it took you to your home tenancy. And when we tried to use the lazy approvals in email, we just got a nasty 403. Unhappy days. Taking it to this guy, who I'm pretty sure you all saw in a kilt on the day, am I right? Taking it to this guy, John was like, what? How are we going to get around this? And for those of you who don't know, this is John Levesque, who, again, bad logo, who is in the Power Automate or Flow team. So we looked at how are we going to get around this? How do we address this particular roadblock? And again, I'm sharing with you how we got around the problem. So this is what we designed. So we had to leverage the Common Data Service. For those of you that know, approvals live inside the Common Data Service. Now, at the time that we did this, you couldn't use the flow approvals from within the default environment. So we had to set up a new production environment to make that work. And so what we did is we got Microsoft Flow to start the approval, just in the standard way. And then we hijacked it a little bit. So we the approval at that point is registered in CDS. So then that's available to us to be able to use. We then replaced with a custom email to send to the external user with the links to approve, so that we made sure that we were bringing them to a place that we knew we could authenticate them. User then logs in to our custom approval site collection, which we hosted within Sharepoint. And with a little bit of Parker magic, we have an SPFX web part that loads, and the connector then uses the API to communicate back to the Common Data Service to then go and get the information about that user approval and to make updates to that user approval, whether it was approved or rejected, etc. That API then triggers the flow to continue and move on to the next stage once approval has happened. So this was a workaround that we did to get past that. And the way that it looked was pretty clever. So the email looks much like this one here, which is much like the longer email that you can get from approvals anyway. Not the pretty one, but certainly the HTML one that you can get. And when they went to the page, Parker wasn't there, when they went to the page, we made it look exactly like the flow approvals page. But as you can see, there are site collection bits around the side of it. So only the keenest of eyes could tell that this was actually not the regular approvals. So that was our workaround. And, went back to John and said, this is how we've done it. And thankfully, because we've got a great production team behind the products at Microsoft, it got put on the roadmap and now it's been delivered. So external approvals are no longer the problem that we had, okay? But just wanted to call out here that we got support from Microsoft and they helped us to say, okay, well, let's raise that as an actual issue and get it sorted. Then we run into a new roadblock. So then the new licensing model actually hit us quite hard, because if you remember what I've said here is that we need that API to access the locked down data. Now the API then became a HTTP request. Okay, so that HTTP action went into premium, and for a university with only the university licensing and no budget for 250 to 500 students that we need to make this a part of their solution, we didn't have the budget to go and buy per app or per flow licenses for them. So we came up with a way around it. So the Casper 365 for Education connector was created now, and that's why really I've used the branding in here just to show you that. So the Casper 365 for Education connector currently exists. And we went through the certification, and this is old data, which is why it's grayed out. And we launched that connector. The only problem is we cannot get that to be a standard connector. So because of timing, that we actually got that connector published, and all it does is the API connection. That unfortunately is a premium connector. So back to square one. So we still don't have a viable solution to be able to put the security in that we wanted to put in to make sure that that data was well hidden. So workarounds are, firstly, currently we are grandfathering. So we still have the functionality to be able to use the HTTP call and the API connector using the Azure API call. And that will serve us until probably 2024 or whatever the grandfathering date is. But I am pushing, and I can get on my soapbox quite quickly about this one, trying to get it so that universities don't have to pay for these custom connectors or for these premium connectors as custom connectors as premium rather, because this is our future generation. These are the people we need to be using this technology so that they get used to it and they insist on it in business going forward. It seems completely counterintuitive to me to be charging for this functionality for a university that is just trying to keep the data secure. Of course, the way we could get around this is we could just send that flow straight to the Sharepoint list. But you know what? Then the user effectively has permissions to write and read that list. Out goes the security. So this is a fight I'm still having. So the next part of the solution, as I mentioned, was to move on to allocating funds. And Parker joined us again as we created an SPFX solution to be able to look at each of those requests as they've come in, to look at the funds that were available, and to create a SharePoint-esque looking form to be able to part allocate to different funds and to be able to complete a transaction so that it could be multi-fund allocated or single fund allocated. But basically, once a request was complete, it appeared as something that needed allocating to funds. If there wasn't a fund that was going to pay for it, then that goes to the college's own funds. So we needed a little bit of magic there just to make that happen for the back end to complete the cycle, because a lot of this information was getting done in multiple Excel spreadsheets, and it gets very, very complex when you've got hundreds of students putting in hundreds of fund allocations, trying to get that to work across many, many funds. So this was an interesting piece of work that we added on to the back of the solution. Reporting then, as I said, all of the data, because it's going into that single request list, can now be looked at, and we can start analysing. This one is hilarious because it's just looking at some of the early data that we collected for a change of course, why they were changing course. And as you can see there, the gold section shows that the majority of the changes were tutor related. So, and I don't even think that's the correct terminology. I think it is professor related. So they didn't like the course once they got on it. But again, this is just looking at the lighter side of this data. But imagine now looking at some of the more interesting forms that needed filling in, and having data really that universities never ever been able to see, with the big piles of paper that simply sit in filing cabinets. So we went and got some student feedback to be able to create version 2, and version 2 looks completely different. Now, some of the stuff that really surprised us about that student feedback was that one of the things that they said back to us was actually the students aren't going to be using their mobile phones, which I did not see coming, and it's certainly not something that was in the original design. So they had a preference for desktop, which is great because that means that we can go into the tablet format. So for version 2, we looked at a more responsive design. We looked for clearer information back to the students and really took on some UX considerations. And so forms started to change. We also put back in the 27 form headings. So you can see on the left we have a list of forms and a search box, because some of these forms are actually the same form underneath but a different title. So we put back in all of the titles and allowed the students to look for forms that they were used to the naming convention for. Each form then, as you click it, shows you the guidance before you go into that form. Again, this is fundamental to allow students to understand when they can submit a certain form, what the qualification criteria is, and it removes the frequency of rejection of requests, because they know the rules up front before they even hit the apply button. So then creating a form, we started to get far more informative about how far through the progress bars showing on the left hand side. We looked at multiple request line item detail, and at the bottom there, although this one doesn't have any, the correct person that is in the chain for the approval process will show up in different colours as it goes through that process. Oh, here we go. So your approval history looks something like this, so that you can see very clearly and very simply where you're at. The other thing that was asked for in this one was the ability to attach files. So we wanted receipts and we wanted multiple receipts. So that needed to be included in a simple and easy to use way. This is drag and drop file attachment area. And again, we've got much more space, so we can add more things in. Instead of having multi-page forms, we can add in some text boxes to allow some typing, and we can add in some more data that we probably wouldn't have fitted on a single phone app for simplicity, and that allows us just generally to use the space a bit better. Again, that's looking at those forms. So again, this would normally be a Q&A session if I was live. So what is my most frequently asked question? I don't actually know. I'm going to pause for breath. Let's move on. We'll come back to this at the end. So the final thing I wanted to share with you, and this is a really light-hearted one, is that we had a requirement for a rooms browser. Now, there are a lot of rooms on campus in a college that students need to be able to choose from. But the complexity there is that how it works is there is a target amount of money that facilitates the provision of those rooms. So if they need to get an income of X amount per year, there is then an algorithm that works out, based on the quality of each of those rooms, what the fee should be each year. So the rooms are banded with A, B and C, etc. And the students have actually written the algorithm that calculates this. So we needed something that complemented the fact that we need to be able to see the rooms, the types of rooms that fit within each banding, individual rooms, what they look like, and the area that they are within the campus buildings. But we also needed to be able to facilitate this algorithm annual change of banding and or funding requirement for each room. And on top of that, we only had 5 days to do it because this came to us really last minute. So it was a really nice quick challenge. How do we solve this one? And here's the architecture that we used for this particular one. So there's a couple of reasons why it is as complex as it is, but let's just quickly go through it. So firstly, there is a photo library that is completely separate to the room booking list. Now, this is because each room can have multiple photos and those photos can be updated at any time. There's also the aspiration to push that photo taking and submission to students that are currently using those rooms. And we have a room booking list that gives us then the detail of those rooms. So that's available to the students to see within the application. So they get that in the nice mobile or tablet app. In the background then, we have this ability with a duplicate list put separately, and there's a really good reason why that's separately, which I'll tell you in a minute, to be able to update the annual banding. So on this list, we hit a button that says, take everything to the duplicate list. And that's using Flow to do that. In the back end, we have an on-premise VM that's got a MySQL and a REST connection to this list data. So once the data is in this list, this is pulled into the SQL database. Algorithms do their magic and students mess with the data, and then they pass it back to this list. Now, again, this is why the separate list. Once they're in this list, it was automatically pushed back to this list once they said, yes, we're fine with that. But we had to introduce an approval step here because the very first time they did it, they pushed it back with completely blank information. So we effectively lost everything. Fortunately, though we had a duplicate list, we had undo or version control on the room booking list itself. So some fun challenges with that, but this was the easiest way to facilitate this algorithmic requirement, the backup that we clearly needed, and the ability to approve these changes before they went live, which they didn't even know was a requirement, but actually ended up being one. So what does this look like? Again, this is not super complex. So what we did was some nice little bits, and these are not student rooms. I just have to clarify that. These are hotel rooms, okay? We put in some nice pretty pictures. But if you saw student rooms, you would turn this video off right now. But what we did, so on the side here, we put a nice filter, and this is a dynamic filter. So as you start filtering, I need an ensuite. Like you're going to get one of those. I need a double bed. Again, there's not very many of those either. But I want to look at a particular room banding. I want it on a particular floor. Maybe I need disability access, and I want to be in a particular building on the campus. So this allows you to filter the results. And then when you click on an individual room location, that then brings up more pictures of the room, which wouldn't you love that to be a student room? And a floor plan, which again are hilarious because they look like a box. They all look the same. That's what we were asked for. We got some key features and then some more details. So the more details might give you something particularly interesting, like how long it takes you to get from one area of the site to another. Previous comments from other students, this gets particularly noisy because it's close to the Chinese takeaway, or hey, this is close to the Chinese takeaway. Whatever it is, there's some extra details that can be put in there. So this was a nice quick app that was developed to be visually pleasant, to give the information quickly and easily. We used a couple of things that weren't particularly mainstream at the time, like this tabbing feature and this live filter that carried on filtering the data set on the right hand side dynamically as you were completing it. So in the 5 days, we created the PowerApp, which was pretty and responsive. We sorted out the data storage and the update solution, even with glitches, and that duplicate and approve step. And it's effectively become an extensible project for them. So it's a starter project. They can do much more with this now that they've got it. But we were asked to do so much in that first 5 days, we decided to leave that further development open and just concentrate on getting some base functionality out. So it's yet another app that the university have to use. Ooh. And that's me. So it wouldn't be right not to mention the sponsors for the Scottish Summit. Thank you very much to these people who make the event happen. And that really ends my presentation. There would normally be another Q&A slide in there, so that threw me a little. If you have got any questions about anything that I've gone through here, and I love to talk about Power Platform in conjunction with education requirements. This really is my soapbox, it's my thing. But at the same time, you know, I've got a great team that I work with, but I love to be out in the community talking to people about what they've created. And I have a blog out there that talks about all the fun things that I find and I come across. We've got a couple of interesting bits out there at the moment around community challenges. And now that we all find ourselves cooped up at home, you know, it would be absolutely my pleasure if any of you wanted to reach out and start a conversation with me. And, you know, a welcome break to staring at my walls. So it's been an absolute pleasure to be a speaker for the Scottish Summit. I hope you have all found something useful in this presentation, and thanks for listening.